I'm Nadia El-Haj. I'm a professor of anthropology, and I'm actually just here as a moderator. So I will introduce our distinguished speakers and then try to moderate the conversation. So it's my pleasure to both introduce this panel and to chair it. Let me do by way of short bios. Our two panelists. So Etienne Balibar is, of course, a distinguished political philosopher, one of the most prominent philosophers in France today. I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, are very familiar with his writings of many decades now. He is visiting professor at Columbia at ICLS in the French department, and he is the emeritus professor at the University of Paris 10, Nanterre, and the anniversary chair of modern European philosophy at Kingston University, London. Professor Balibar's interlocutor today is Mohamad Amer Meziane, who's a French-Algerian philosopher and musician, which I did not know about the musician. I'm very happy to know that. Mohamad earned his PhD in philosophy from the Sorbonne and is currently postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Religion, Culture, and Public Life here at Columbia. I want briefly to pause to thank Dr. Meziane for organizing the event today under the auspices of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, which I would also like to thank for their support. So today's panel is really going to unfold both as presentations, but really a discussion. It's the continuation of previous discussions between Professor Balibar and Dr. Meziane that began in France in 2016 at the Sorbonne and continued at Columbia University with the addition of a major figure in anthropology to that conversation, that is Talal Asad. The context for these conversations have been the political violence, or more specifically, the theological political violence and anti-Muslim racism in France, especially in the aftermath of the attacks on the Bataclan Theater, cafes in Paris, and at the Stade de France in Saint-Denis in 2015. The question of violence, as it is conceptualized in Professor Balibar's recent writings, is central to the conversation today. So the structure is as follows. Dr. Meziane will begin the session by responding to some of Professor Balibar's thinking on violence and racism, grounding his comments in his own work on philosophical secularism and the racialization of Islam. In turn, Professor Balibar will respond, after which there'll be time for a more informal exchange between our two panelists, as well as a Q&A. I want to invite people in the audience to submit your questions through the Q&A, and you can do that throughout the talk. And at some point, I will be reading them and actually introducing them into the discussion. So each speaker, I think, is going to speak for about 15 minutes, is my understanding. Before I hand over the floor to Dr. Meziane, I would like to say to the speakers, I will chat you when you're getting close to your time limit, so that I don't have to interrupt. And I also just want to say to the audience, if at some point I turn my video off, it's not that I've gone AWOL, it's that I have extraordinarily unstable internet in my house at the moment. So if it looks like I'm going to lose the connection, I may turn the video off for a bit to try to stabilize it. Okay, I hand the floor over. Mohamad, please.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you all for being here today. I want to make just a few remarks about, what is sometimes called positionality. So I will talk as a scholar working on the racialization of Islam, both in colonized Algeria and in France, with also a particular interest in what I tend to describe as the secularity of European philosophical reason from Hegel until today, to say it very, generally. And I certainly include Etienne Balibar in this long tradition. I want to say that in the tense political and intellectual context where I began my work, Balibar was one of the very few interlocutors a scholar like me actually had in the field of philosophy in France when I started my research some years ago. So before I start, I want to thank him for his commitment to pursue this conversation during the past actually 4 years under multiple forums. I also want to thank the IRCPL team, Matthew Engelke, Mariana Pecoraro, Walid Hammam, and Madeleine de Jesus, for putting this event together, and Nadia El-Haj for accepting to moderate the event and take part in the discussion. So I will not talk about the pandemic or public health as such, neither will I talk about Black Lives Matter in the US, and I actually claim no expertise on either of these topics. And to some extent, as far as the ongoing crisis is concerned, this discussion has already been organized recently here at Columbia during a conversation between Etienne, Balibar, Suleiman Bashir, Diane, Emmanuel Saada, and which was moderated by Barnard Harcourt. Instead, I want to think of this discussion as an occasion to conceptualize violence in light, or reconceptualize violence in the light of the present situation. So the expression I decided to choose as a title, States of Violence, refers to the relation between violence and the modern state, and thus describes sovereignty as one of the most important matrices of violence, a violence of which, in my view, race is a manifestation. States of violence also refers to the modes of existence of the phenomenon we describe as violence to what might be called the ontological reality or realities of violence. I immediately want to say that I will not engage directly with this question, which oftentimes conceals another one, that is to say, is violence reducible to a negation? Instead, I want to think about and think of different states of violence as moments of my talk in order to try and organize the conversation that will follow around 4 different zones of inquiry. And they read as follow: violence and sovereignty, both of capital and state; violence and race; violence and the one; violence and the universal. This short, I hope short, introductory inquiry into these states of violence will therefore become progressively metaphysical, as I will make some comments about the violence of the universal in relation to an older but somehow repressed philosophical problem, namely the question of the one. To the extent that politics surrounds us and remains unavoidable, as most attempts to avoid it attest, our very capacity to live by resisting the surrounding threats of death implies that we stand somewhere within the space of violence. The recent globalization of the Black Lives Matter movement in the middle of the pandemic thus serves as a reminder of this fact. The struggle against racism, defined as a necro-political system of organized violence, places us as the heart of the problem while pointing to the existence of this unescapable space called politics or violence. Since the spread of anti-racist movements in the West and the globalization of Black Lives Matter since June, Islamophobia in its post-9/11 form is, so to speak, coming back at the forefront of Western systemic racism, seen as what is now happening in France shows us. I do hope we will have the time to think about this during the conversation and draw some comparison between what happened in the US and elsewhere. But before we do that, I would like to formulate some tentative ideas about that. I would simply say, or begin saying that one of the major differences is that in the case of Islamophobia, race seems to operate through the construction of religion as a sign of violence, which is attributed to Islam and thus projected onto the bodies of Muslims. Hence, anti-Muslim racism is a typical form of racism to the extent that through religion it functions as race, and actually is race. For this reason, I wouldn't say that it deploys a form of cultural racism, and I wouldn't say either, actually, before thinking that way, though, that we could call it a racism without race, even though this formula proposed by Balibar a long time ago in his foundational essay on race, nation, and class is certainly compelling. But I would rather suggest that as religion, race can be both deployed and denied in the meantime, and that this denial authorizes an intensification of violence to the point where precisely resistance to racism becomes virtually impossible. I think that what is happening in France might go in this direction, unfortunately. And if there was such a thing as Muslim Lives Matter, it would probably be very quickly delegitimized via the suspicion that such a movement confuses politics and religion, and therefore would be constructed as a threat to the public order. Interestingly, since Balibar's work on race, at least, and maybe actually even before, religion has been tendentially absent from much theorization of race, despite the fact that Edward Said's Orientalism has shown as early as the late 70s that the making of race is inseparable from the making of religion and non-religion, and more specifically of how Islam is actually conceptualized by the West as we know. Now, let me begin by formulating a tentative hypothesis that the world in which we are now living, beset as it is by COVID-19, might contradict a prediction. This prediction, prophetic or non-prophetic, is the one that foresaw a progressive decline in the power of nation state due to the emergence of the GAFAM complex, namely a form of capitalism structured by the hegemony of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. My first point is that the situation we are now in is more uncertain than the idea of a decline in state power or of its powerlessness assumes. But the increasing power of the GAFAM since the beginning of COVID doesn't seem to lead to a decline of the state, but rather to an intensification of state violence through the transformation of its very nature, or at least that would be part of this hypothesis. Arguably, sovereign states are now in competition with what Balibar would call quasi-sovereign big tech companies, and this situation seems to increase the militarization of politics and the use of violence by states, which of course include systemic racism. Therefore, can one still argue that the articulation of state violence and the form of capital that is now emerging will lead to the decline of the former's power, let alone to its powerlessness? Therefore, how are we to think about one of Balibar's most provocative suggestions that the impotence of the all-powerful is an essential determinant of institutional racism in our democratic states? My first response would be this. It might make no difference for Black and brown bodies that the kind of violence that threatens their lives can be understood or derived actually as a manifestation of the state's powerlessness. Is it possible to operate such a deduction when one is phenomenologically threatened by police brutality? Secondly, isn't systemic racism still made exceptional and to some extent external to the functioning of the state apparatus when it is defined as an effect of the state's powerlessness rather than its power? If extreme violence is a manifestation of the state's existence as such, or at least one possibility linked to the very nature of the state, and thus internal to its sovereignty, then why should racist violence be thought of as a phenomenon related to the state's fragility, as I think Balibar would suggest, or at least logically has to suggest? Balibar's idea, according to which violence and racism stem from the powerlessness of the state, is certainly compelling, but I would suggest that it is inseparable from the propensity to analyze the forms of violence that Western liberal democracies deploy as a mere compensatory manifestation of their powerlessness. Is it then, one might ask, a way of assuming that racism is a betrayal of the principles of equal liberty, rather than thinking of racism as a possibility inscribed within liberal democracy itself? Hence, how is racism linked to a constitutive propensity to deploy violence, constitutive of, liberal democracy and its relation to the modern state? Also, is the increasing and seemingly inexorable brutality and hence the cruelty of the state understandable as a mere decline of power, which engenders a desire for the state, as Balibar sometimes tend to argue? Or is it rather a reorganization of sovereignty at the center of which stands the deployment of violence, and therefore a qualitative change rather than a mere decline? Also, why refer to powerlessness when one's body actually faces and is directly threatened by a form of power that is exacerbated by the anxiety of its own failure? In other words, is it persuasive to argue that the causes of the cruelty of the state do not lie in its power, but rather in its impotence? If one also asserts that its power is its impotence itself? And lastly, if sovereign power is inseparable from the possibility of its failure, then how can we say that the cause of racism and cruelty is not the state itself? This being said, you might think, that I'm an anarchist, and I know that Balibar has sometimes described my position as such, which is not always a compliment, but I think actually is not exactly true, and I will try to explain why. And I do think that this characterization reflects, in my view, a European understanding of the critique of the states of violence or the violence of the state. So some remarks about anarchism. Anarchism and its total refusal of the state can only end up refusing politics if one acknowledges that state will most probably not disappear, at least in the foreseeable future. In other words, the political consequences of the critique of the state are so multiple and unpredictable that they cannot be reduced to what European activism defines as anarchism. I therefore share Balibar's and other figures' double refusal of both the communist idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat on the one hand and the anarchist mythology of a world without states on the other. But a politics premised upon a critique of the state, which in my view is something else or is irreducible to anarchism as such. So this politics could imply a permanent refusal of its degeneration into powerless and in fact illusionary forms of anarchism. Now, is a politics of civility, if by that we mean a politics that tries to dissolve a kind of violence which in the meantime is unescapable. So is a politics of civility condemned to remain anarchic and to be formulated in opposition to the state? In order to appreciate the extent to which the call to abolish the police and thus maybe the modern state itself, because one might not be possible with the first might not be possible without the abolition of the second. In order to appreciate the extent to which this call remains a utopian demand, we might note that a contemporary politics of civility can be found in the way in which, for example, Arab revolutions or the ongoing Iraq have declared a civil state, Dawla Madaniya, as their horizon. Now, I have some remarks about how the civility might be opposed and actually distinguished from this notion of civilizing violence, but I will probably leave that to the discussion if we do talk about that. Now I just want to make some remarks and ask some questions about the relation between violence and the specter of the one. So, because it's of course linked to this question of anarchism. Balibar, among others, argues that modern forms of communitarian and thus also racist violence are indebted to what he calls the primacy of the one. This argument precisely to an anarchist trope, which is of course not exclusively anarchist, namely that the violence of the state are images or effects of an illusion, that is the power of the one God. To some extent, we could say that even the idea of a monopoly of violence reproduces this trope, and this is precisely why anarchism asserts ni Dieu ni maître, no God, no master, because it presupposes a continuity between God's power and earthly sovereignty that precisely it wants to dismantle by negating the existence of God as a prerequisite of any kind of political emancipation. Now, the violence deployed against migrants, Black and brown bodies, and also against Muslim, religious or not, is premised upon the racist attribution of violence to their bodies. Hence, as we know, it becomes possible to legitimize police brutality and the use of lethal weapons as so-called necessary forms of violence from the point of view of the defense of the public order by the state. But beyond that general claim, one question still remains in my view. How exactly does racism attribute violence to the body it racializes? When Muslims are murdered, they are seen as representing the threat of terror and fanaticism, namely of what is often seen in the West and also beyond as the most extreme kind of violence, namely non-Christian monotheism's violence, and specifically Islam. Now, our racialized images or projections of Muslims as embodying religious or theological political violence, remnants of this primacy of the one? Aren't they precisely aspects of how the one, and thus Islamic monotheism, provokes a form of hatred in the West that is inseparable from the invention of the so-called Semites? Isn't it what engenders the racist ideas of Muslims, supposed propensity to deploy violence that defines them as threats or public enemies, as the case of France now testifies again? And as other contemporary manifestations of Islamophobia show outside the West, actually, this form of exclusion of one community by another might produce, an even greater potential for ethnic cleansing and thus for extreme violence. I would therefore suggest provocatively that the powerlessness of the state is theological political because the kind of absolute power that the state necessarily claims is immediately linked to the question of the divine, regardless of its reality or unreality, and therefore regardless of the question of whether we believe in God or not. Whether one defines the divine or God as real or unreal, the sovereign state remains indebted to these theological specters of sovereignty. Now, if race is the manifestation of a structural failure, then it manifests the constitutive impossibility, inscribed at the very heart of earthly sovereignty, defined as this quasi-divine power, despite the ongoing efforts of what might be called generally, of course, the imperial Christian West, to secure it. My intention is certainly not to praise any theological return of the one against the philosophies of the multiple, the other, or of difference. I simply want to suggest that what Balibar, among others, criticizes as the primacy of the one, or its violence, might be the phenomenon of an impossibility, that is to say, the impossible desire to be one or unique on earth, that nations and states manifest in their propensity to racialize bodies and mind, and thus to oppress and kill. Now, Balibar also asserts that forms of violence are manifestation not only of sovereignty, but of quasi-sovereignty, which is a form of power that functions as if it were sovereign, but nonetheless remains irreducible to sovereign power. Now, of course, the question I will ask, I want to try and question this assumption that actually the primacy of the one serves as a paradigm or a model of how violence actually functions, even in its so-called secular form. Now, is quasi-sovereignty another name for governmentality, namely the proliferation and the intensification of what Foucault described as pastoral power, exceeding the realm of the one and of the sovereign, and thus functioning beyond any reproduction of its alleged primacy? If quasi-sovereignty is part of what Foucault has described as the death of empire and the birth of governmentality, then shouldn't we start questioning the very traditional and probably Eurocentric idea according to which the primacy of the one, that is to say monotheism and maybe therefore Islam, is our common enemy? Indeed, what kind of anti-racism, and this is really a question, does this particular assumption imply, and whose experience is being marginalized, if not excluded, from this language of liberation? This brings me to my last set of comments, which relate, as I was mentioning in my introduction, relates to the way in which Balibar thinks about universalism as a source of violence, or at least a certain kind of universalism, precisely a kind of universalism that would be indebted to the primacy of the one. No, I want to be very clear about the fact that I think that Balibar's position is, needless to say, or maybe I should say it precisely, is profoundly dialectical in the sense that it asserts that oneness is the matrix of universalism's violence, and therefore that the specter of the one within the universal actually produces division. Hence, conflicts is the result of the one, and this, even though the one is a real illusion, you might say. And this leads Balibar to deploy a strategy of pluralizing the universal via actually a theory of translation. For this reason,
Mohamad, if you could wrap up in a few minutes.
yes,
okay.
I will try to finish. For this reason, I think it would be too easy to oppose actually a concept of the particular to the so-called domineering nature of the universal. I would say so for at least one reason. That is that I would tend to question the idea according to which, you know, universal on the one hand would be colonial, and claims of irreducible particularities would be, for example, decolonial, because both conflicting claims are actually part of a colonial scenes or two faces of one bifurcated colonial structure, to mention one of Mahmoud Mabdali's concepts. Now, let me end on these remarks, which, yeah, I hope will help wrapping up. Then my conclusion would read as follows. That is to say, it is the rejection of the one as a paradigm of violence that remains unthought, precisely because it is an assumption that critical theory, in most of its form or most dominant forms, does not seem to critique precisely. This exclusion of the one is, in my view, a metaphysical, if not a highly political, theological gesture. And it leaves oneness unthought as a concept, making it a very confused image of violence, in my view, that one would have to overcome to liberate oneself, whatever that means. And one of the consequences of this gesture is that religion, and I should actually say monotheism, and maybe more specifically Islamic monotheism, always remains the paradigm through which one thinks about violence as such. So I will end here, and yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I will now hand the floor over to Etienne, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have 15 minutes, and yes, do I?
Yes, you do.
Yes, I do.
Sorry.
Okay. And Nadia, please do the right thing. That is, cut me or warn me or tell me that I have to stop wherever I find myself, because I'm a dangerous, some people already know that, speaker in terms of expanding and going who knows where. Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot to you all, the Institute, you, Nadia. It's a great honor to have you as a moderator, meet you for the first time in almost physical manner after reading you for so many years. And of course, thank my dear friend Mohamad for setting up the discussion and allowing me this perilous function, perilous seat, as the legend would put it, of the respondent who at the same time is the defendant. So I find myself in a somewhat strange situation, because I am not against controversies, you know, and even polemics, provided they remain civil. But it's also not something I like so much. And in fact, the circumstances in which we are speaking push me in the direction of saying and expressing the hope that we talk and discuss not only about formulas, but about situations and problems which we are facing, perhaps not exactly at the same place, but certainly in a situation that is common for us all. On the other hand, of course, I'm not going to retreat, and so I will, yes, say a few things about my positions in the past. So we'll see how far I can go, but I begin with the issue of religion and the theological political, which really seems to be crucial in your view, in your perception. I'll continue with the question of the state, the withering away of the state, the powerlessness of the state, the the challenge to the sovereignty of the state in contemporary capitalism, to put it like that. And I wish to be able to also arrive at the issue of racism, but it will be there all the time. So on the first point, I have two things to say. One is I will readily concede, because you made a reference which gives me great honor, to the ideas I had developed 40 years ago in the book written in close collaboration with my late friend Immanuel Wallerstein, the great theorist of the capitalist world system, who passed away, as you probably all know, just a few months ago. I had used that formula of racism without races, and I wasn't the only one who used similar formulas, but I don't go into every detail. And then, of course, I was led to insist on certain dimensions or causes to which I would say variations and adaptations of the racist, of the systemic racism. I always share the idea of the systemic racism that is so important in today's conjuncture, could become formulated in shifting languages, different languages with different references. I would also readily admit that there was something very Eurocentric in my way of describing it at the time, not in Wallerstein's way, but in my way, and even Franco-centric to many, which paradoxically led to a blind spot in my. Because where we are tonight and what's on the agenda, and you refer to Black Lives Matter and its global importance. The first thing I would have to say about that is that being Eurocentric didn't perhaps so much mean that we were ignoring the colonial world. In France, that would be impossible, especially for somebody like me, whose political education was entirely due to the circumstances of the war of independence of Algeria. But with respect to the United States, I mean, the more I read and hear and become involved with the situation in this country, we're in America tonight, the more I realize that I had left aside certain very important dimensions. And that particularly refers, of course, to the whole issue of the color line. I mean, that it is not that I was underestimating the importance of color, but I certainly had a tendency at the time to stress, and therefore the question of the body, as you mentioned it a moment ago, and the skin. I'm teaching a class on Fanon these days, and somehow bending the stick in the direction that was relatively fashionable at the time of the new cultural racism. Now, the blind spot, among others, and I absolutely admit that, was that religion played no role or no specific role in this description. And as a consequence, what you describe, and I also agree completely with that, as the racialization of Islam and Islamism and so on, and the fact that Islamophobia is one, if not the main form in which we can observe systemic racism, discourses, aggressions, etc. in France today, in countries like France today, is something that remained largely out of the picture. Of course, soon after that, I began correcting that, but that blind spot is crucial. And therefore, of course, I agree that you're right to put this in the center. One of the reasons probably why, and that will lead me to the next point, why I was so blind in a sense, was the fact that I still had at the time a tendency to include the religious question within, historically and contemporary, within a kind of broad framework called the cultural. And of course, the more as the situation evolved, and our conversations have been important for that, but you mentioned Tal al-Assad, of course, reading his work was also an incitement. The more I became convinced, I haven't reached a final discourse on that because it's a complicated issue, that we ought not to confuse pure and simply the cultural issues and the religious or theological issues. Which leads me to, so therefore, if there is a racialization of religion, and particularly Islam in France today, it has cultural dimensions, but it has specifically religious dimensions. So which leads me to the next point, which is this, this question of the one. So you seem to be absolutely obsessed by that. I mean, and as a consequence, you attribute—
So are you.
No, I'm not. You attribute to me a discourse which I hardly find in my own writings, where everything would derive from what you call the primacy of the one, and specifically the theological one. That is the one that is, of course, common with important differences and nuances to all three great monotheisms in Western history, because all the three belong to Western history. That is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'm absolutely not obsessed by that. And there are two reasons for that, if you like. One is theoretical, and the other one is empirical. Begin with the empirical reason. Nadia, how much time did I take already?
Only you have another easily 10 minutes.
Okay. So I have to accelerate because the other points are. So
you can go a little longer, Mohamad.
The empirical reason is, if you look, take Islamophobia precisely, or the hatred of Muslims across the world today as a starting point of discussion. There's absolutely no way in which you can ground or found the most cruel and violent forms of Islamophobia in the world to some sort of primacy of the one or a monotheistic legacy. Where do you put the Rohingyas? Where do you put the horrible suppression of the Uyghurs in China? Where do you put the situation in India? So monotheism is not and cannot be, and the reference to the one cannot be the root cause of the various forms of racialization and persecutions of Muslims in the world. Then, theoretical reason. What if I try to say something in my book, Violence and Civility, which has all the weaknesses you want? This was precisely, and I stick to that idea even when I have to change and criticize many of the details. I always stick to the idea that the forms of extreme violence, including extremely violent racism, we observe in the world and we observe in history, never had and never have a single source or cause. Of course, this is where I departed from classical Marxism, because I said you cannot explain that only by capitalism. Even colonialism or imperialism as the real actual form of historical capitalism, Wallerstein's great thesis and others with him. And also not, of course, on the other side, ideological, to put it in the classical language. And I now increasingly tend to pure and simply say spiritual. The spiritual power causes. So what you always have is a combination, an over-determination of both. And that creates, of course, simultaneous effects, but not only one, not only one, and especially not the one as an idea. So you'll speak later. And so from there, let me move to the question of the state and retain something of the question of the one. Of course, the one as a theological and metaphysical concept is complex by definition. But traditionally, we know, and this belongs to the Islamic tradition as well as the Judaic and the Christian one, that under the edges, so to speak, of the one, there are two problems, and you mentioned them. There's the problem of unity. There's the problem of unity, and there is the problem of unicity. Can you say that in English? Yes, I guess so. I hope so. So on the one hand, the question of what makes a community, one community, and everybody in the community forced, in a sense, to choose between being inside or being outside, or forced to be either inside or outside. This is the whole question, of course, of the treatment of the foreigner, the stranger, the alien in political communities, which have inherited from a certain theological tradition, a certain representation of their own unity or oneness in that sense. And on the other side, of course, you have the question of unicity, which is there is only one legitimate principle. So when the two, of course, reinforce each other, that creates not automatically forms of exclusion and expulsion and destruction and hatred of the other, but a very powerful instrument for material causes or forces to use spiritual ways of excluding and including. So I'm afraid, so I'm too late now. So one quick word on the state. Thank you for saying that we can be neither statists nor anarchists. This is the great problem of today. And the pandemic adds to that problem, because it seems to me that very obviously, we need states, but we don't need the states we have. On the contrary, the states we have are catastrophic. And this is not only true in France, but it is true in the United States and perhaps elsewhere. The great successes of the Chinese state are, of course, a big problem. And I have many friends everywhere in the world who write to me to say, you see, your European democratic liberal state is failing, but the Chinese idea of the state is now triumphant. Leave that open. We need the state, or more precisely, we need the public. We need the public. We need the public services. We need the public sphere. We need the public, the institutions of the public, nationally and transnationally. Now, whether that can be done with or without actual states, that's the question. And second, powerlessness of the state. You attribute to me a completely delirant discourse. I never said that state racism was the result of the powerlessness of the state. But I admit that there could be a kind of vacillation and absence of clarity in my text, which you brought together. On the one hand, there's the question of whether in today's cosmopolitics there exist political forces, which are not the nation states. And the answer, I believe, is yes. But what I have most in mind are not the GAFA, or is not simply the GAFA, the big corporations. That's an idea already there from the 30s and the 40s. The question is the global financial structure. And therefore, of course, it's the power of money. The money, this is what I call quasi-sovereignty. It's not unified. Be careful about that. And on the other hand, of course, I wrote somewhere, and I repeated that several times in various in the circumstances in France, that certain aspects, fundamental for me, of course, aspects of racism had to be attributed not to the fact that the state was so powerful, but that the state seemed to be powerless in the eyes of its own citizens. So the question was not the state racism. The question was, and I still believe it's an important question, the question was the question of the mass, the question of the petty whites that we have in France and that you have in the US. The question is the question of the interaction or the reciprocity of influences between the actions of the state on one side and the propensities and the exacerbation of racist hatred on the side of middle class citizens. So let's stop there. We could discuss the point, but that was what I had in mind, that they perceived the state as weak in terms of controlling immigration, in terms of resisting globalization and so on and so on. And that led directly to their continuously pressuring the state to demonstrate that it was acting in favor of its own majority, becoming quickly a minority, in fact, in the US, through the oppression of the ex-colonial subjects, migrants, and so on. Finally, if I may, in a very, very
2 minutes, can I give you 2 more minutes?
Two 1 minute. In a very, etc. Something asked me, what do I make of prison abolition? Later in the discussion. Good question. So last point, violence, statist and counter violence. What is taking place in France today and in other countries pushes me to something I hope is not simply provocative, but is a crucial issue. The problem, of course, is with the systemic violence of the state and the extreme or the excess of violence of the state for a number of reasons. But in a sense, I'd be ready to say that this is intrinsic to the state structure. And when you say necropolitics, Bembe's formula, etc., I agree with that. But the problem is also the problem of the counter violence, of the anti-state violence, and particularly the problem of the terrorist violence. So what we have to do in France tonight is, of course, an extremely worrying proliferation of racist discourses, which identify every Muslim in our countries with a potential terrorist. I might even add, because this is very important for me, that the whole issue of the caricatures of the Prophet perhaps doesn't lie so much with the fact that it was blasphemy, etc. For me, it lies with the fact that if you look at the caricatures, what it shows are bougnoul, as we say in French. That is colonial Arabs caricature, etc. So this is very powerful. But on the other hand, of course, we are caught, we are trapped between a statist violence and an anti-statist violence. And I maintain, of course, more than ever, as I did in my book, Violence and Civility, that this fork, this strike is deadly for politics. It what destroys politics. So of course I have no influence on Daesh, Al-Qaeda, or crazy guys who, because of poverty, despair, or or fanaticism, become enrolled in such networks or currents and cut the throat of a young professor almost in his class. On the other hand, I have a power, a certain power, or I try as a citizen to have a certain influence, very difficult, I admit, on our own nationalist and bureaucratic and neoliberal state. But the danger lies in this symmetry. And therefore, of course, as always, I ask the question for which I don't have a simple answer, is anti-statist violence, revolutionary or other, when it becomes itself endowed with an ideology of this type, bound to become itself, of course, the mimetic figure of the state. And I will not repeat. I will repeat with caution something that I had said already at the time of the 2015 murders. And Talal Assad, whom you mentioned, said to me, I cannot agree with you on that. I had said, speaking to the French audience, our fate is in the hands of the Muslims, because they have to theologically detach themselves from a certain idea or a certain interpretation of the jihad. This is, of course, I don't believe that the word of the imams will change the world, but I do believe that this can be an important issue. Whereas at the same time, of course, it's a very delicate one, because the racists and the anti-Muslims in French are loudly calling for that. But a few days ago, our friend Souleymane Bachir Diagne wrote an excellent piece in the French journal Le Monde, in which he demonstrated, and this is close to Assad, that there is no absolute reason in the Islamic tradition why the caliphate should be considered an article of faith. I found that remarkably interesting, and I think that we need the same for jihad.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Etienne. So we have till 4, a little after 4. Mohamad, do you want to do some brief responses, and then we can go back and forth between the two of you discussing and me taking questions from the panel? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. No, I mean, I suppose I have to clarify one idea or one hypothesis, because it's mainly, questions I was asking. I certainly don't think that the one as such is a cause of anti-Muslim racism. You seem to have understood this in what I was saying, which is not exactly what I was arguing. As you know, actually, because we already talked about that, I was simply questioning and mentioning the fact that there is an assumption, a theoretical assumption, that seems to presuppose that violence, the way in which violence functions, is premised upon a certain verticality, a certain kind of transcendence, and that actually oneness, or a certain kind of primacy of the one, actually is a paradigm.
I didn't write that.
Then,
sorry, Mohamad, I didn't write that.
Then what did you write? I mean, I think it's just an assumption that
I wrote what I was trying to. Okay, go ahead.
And so I do think that it's this attribution which is important, not the fact of saying, which is also not something I'm actually saying, that monotheism as such is the cause of anti-Muslim racism, of Islam or Islamophobia. I'm actually quite the contrary. I do think that the attribution I mean, the idea that actually a certain kind of violence, or the most extreme forms of violence, stem from monotheism and this and the way in which, for example, people like Jan Assmann conceptualize monotheism is precisely something.
Interesting reference.
I do think that this reference is something that actually has influenced some of your work, and I do think that this assumption is present. This is the only thing I was saying. I was actually.
So can I come in? Oh,
please.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. So I'm wondering, can I make a comment about this? Although,
oh, sure, we
it's
want
frozen
you
for
to
me.
comment.
And then, I mean, it strikes me that at least at the end of what Mohamad was saying is and I read the piece that you have forthcoming in, I don't know in where, but it's what Mohamad's
When you
responding to.
say you, Nadia, is that Mohamad or me?
Sorry, you, Etienne. It sounds that part of the response is to the question of the problematic of the communitarian for you, right? That it's always this tension around oneness that has to have an other. And I just understood, Mohamad, maybe I'm wrong, that what you were saying at the end was in some ways that therefore to overcome, that whatever this political otherwise will be seems then to require exiting the particular, which as a kind of politics of the communitarian requires this distinct, it requires some fictional belief in a one. I mean, that's where I think there might be some overlap, Etienne, that he's reading what he's reading out of that question about the communitarian. But okay, so why don't you respond to that, and then I'm going to ask a very different question, because I suspect you guys should argue about this.
Because I seem to be violently rejecting his critique, and of course it is not that I refused the discussion. So what do you say about that? I'd like to go back to this issue of unity and unicity or oneness in that sense. I think this is an important clarification to be made. It seems to me, perhaps I'm wrong, but that was already my argument in Race, Nation and Class when I pushed as strongly as I could in the direction of associating, I would say, the tradition of racist discourses in our countries, our colonial countries of the West, with the specific form of the nation state, which can be disputed. So Mohamad added to this something which I didn't totally ignore, but it was more on the side of Wallerstein, and I absolutely agree that this raises an essential issue, which is the intrinsic articulation of nation or nation state and empire in various forms, but colonial empires as well, in the whole history of modern of the West. That's but in any case, the point that I found that I insisted on is that a nation wants to be and claims to be a totality. This has to be, and this of course is linked to its own specific form of universalism. So liberté, égalité, fraternité. All the citizens are members, perhaps with huge inequalities, of the same body. Except what you observe, and you could discuss that in Derridian terms, blah, 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 is you observe both in history and in the text, is that this totality or this unity of the body politic is in fact impossible. Not only it is impossible empirically, because there are people who do not automatically integrate or assimilate in the common culture or the common values, but because somehow that's the strangest and the most troubling, of course. But you can read that literally in the founding fathers of the French Republic. For the nation to become this totality, certain foreign bodies, certain aliens have to be expelled or rejected. And this used to be, of course, historically, first the aristocrats, then the Jews, and now these are the migrants. So there is a structural, the colonies are an almost antithetic picture, because of course you cannot expel the natives from the colonies where they have to work and tool and etc. So there, of course, you have different picture. But in the nation itself, you're confronted with that. So is that theological? No. Not essentially. I'm even ready to accept in discussions I recently had with some others that when the religions, and particularly the so-called universal religions, but not only, it's true of Hindutva as well, of course, present themselves as unified bodies from which the foreign body, the alien, the other, which can be identified through skin, customs, cooking and eating practices, creeds, etc., is identified and violently suppressed. This doesn't come so much, in fact, from the religious tradition itself, than from the nationalism. And I believe it's true in India today and in other places as well. So it's the representation, the fantasy of the national body that is here at odds, of course, or directly weighing on the brutal and ultra-violent suppression of other bodies. That's what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, I mean, I was, I also want to mention, or to go back to the fact that you were referring to what you said after the attacks, and we already talked about the fact that you were using the word reform, and then I mean, I'm not going to go back in this debate, but it's interesting that you mention arguments either developed by Suleiman Bashirdiani or Talal Assad. We could also, of course, add
very different.
While Al-Halak to the picture, which of course are very different, but is precisely, I think, what I'm trying to say, and that seems not to be clear, or seems to engender a certain kind of resistance. So I want to make this clear and to take the time to make this clear, because I certainly didn't. I mean, I wanted to ask questions and not, go into this sort of conflict, or just put you in any kind of.
It's not a conflict. You have to say what you think.
No, yes, I'm going to do it. I just need some time, you see. I do think that to be able to argue that what we call the Islamic State is actually an impossibility, a structural impossibility, when one has to, in different ways, of course, either theologically or historically, it depends, show that actually there is something about the very nature of the state itself that cannot be defined as Islamic, which of course always presupposes a more or less normative concept of what Islam or the Islamic is. Now, I think that when I was mentioning anarchism and actually saying that I do not think that this concept is sufficient to describe some kinds of theological critique of the states, which includes potentially a critique, unambiguous critique of the Islamic state, that precisely these kind of critiques do imply actually that one takes the idea of an absolute transcendence of God, which is, in the case of Islam, you might say, inseparable from the question of unicity or absolute singularity, or you might call this Tawheed, or use this word to
Tawheed.
And in this case, Etienne, this is what I'm trying to say, you see, that in this case, the critique of the state is not the same as what European anarchists have done. That is to say, you have to presuppose not only the reality of the divine, but its absolute transcendence, which means that there is no possible continuity between what is called God and what is called the state, and that actually the rejection of something such as a so-called Islamic State precisely stems from transcendence itself. Now, my argument, Etienne, which is not an attack or whatever, is that I do think that, and I take the critical right to do a certain kind of diagnosis of what I think is at the heart of what structures the limitations of, I would say, the European left. I don't know to what extent it applies to the US, to be very honest, but certainly the European left, and very precisely the French left. That is to say, yes, which is two things. The first thing is that at some point, it seems that because race is constructed as religion, at some point, it seems that there is some sort of trouble to build alliances, clear alliances with...
Absolutely. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I know you agree.
Okay.
No, I know you agree with this. It's not that's
why the recognition or violent rejection of the very name Islamophobia is such a crucial political issue in France today.
Yeah, because of course.
Okay.
I just have a second point.
Okay.
I just have a second point, which is very important. The second point is that behind that, to some extent, or at the foundation, you might say, of this kind of debate and these kind of attitudes, you might say, of the left, I do think that this is related to something we should question. It's not, I'm not saying, you know, you are bad people and, you know, these white people, they don't understand and so on. I just want us to question something that, you know, people who are my friends and so on have been, you know, mostly philosophers and so on, but an assumption that they have. And this assumption is that as soon as you have something like oneness, in whatever form is it, believing in one God or any kind of oneness, it's, you know, considered as bad and potentially repressive. This is what I'm questioning. And this, I think, is an assumption. Philosophically, I was trying to question this assumptions and traces, Etienne, traces of this assumption. Traces of these assumptions. They might be conscious, they might be unconscious sometimes. In some of your hypothesis, but also others. This was not a. It was more of a diagnosis, critical, of course, but also questioning diagnosis, if you might put it that way, rather than, you know, a straightforward critique, as if I would have, you know, the definitive answer about that. I hope I'm making this clearer.
Okay, I think we need to. I want to open this up a bit to the audience.
Absolutely. I just want to say that I leave it to readers, if they have the desire, slightest desire, to go to the text to decide whether I consciously or even implicitly share the hypothesis that Mohamad is attributing to the so-called European or French left, which is in scrambles, in fact.
Okay, so I want to switch the conversation a little bit off oneness and onto the question of race and racism specifically. And I'm going to say a few words and then pull in a couple of the questions. One of the things, because in different ways, both of you have mentioned, so what is Europe or France or Europe more generally, although it's not all the same, and then the US.
Yes.
So anti-Blackness versus, or in relationship to Islamophobia. It's interesting to think about, okay, so the category of extreme violence and the question of the migrant in Europe, right? But the thing that's really interesting when thinking about Islamophobia, let's just stick to France, which I know more about than many other places in Europe, but is that in some sense, the category of the migrant has always remained entangled there, right? So Blacks, whatever the history of slavery, the structural racism in American society, there isn't the same kind of question around whether or not Black Americans are citizens. But what happens in France every time there's an attack, right, is someone is referred to as an immigrant, even if this person was born and bred in France, right? So I think that that's really interesting to think about also around well, let me say two things about the different structural racisms around citizenship and Blackness in the US versus in France. But also in the Trump era, it's really striking how much there's a piece of an American racism that is coming to approximate much more that migrant question around Hispanics, right? Well, you're a migrant, will you ever be a citizen? Will you ever belong? But it's a different configuration. So that's one thing I wanted to just put on the table.
No, it's important.
The other thing I wanted to think about, and then I'm going to put another question in, is it strikes me, and maybe it's just because I wrote this whole book on genealogy and race. So to what extent the concept of Muslims as a race is a genealogical one in the ways in which, and I think, okay, in the ways in which Jews are, but it isn't and isn't. So my question is, can one ever stop being a Muslim in France, right? In the way that, can you ever stop being? I don't know if there's an equivalence there, and that's an honest question. And then I'm going to pull from here a question that it says, can you explain why you talk of racism and not white supremacy?
Yeah, I've seen that.
And the second question, I just want to kind of this is what it says, but I want to torque it a little bit. What does Balibar have to say about the laïcité of the French state turning the secular stance into a religious positioning? I would want to add to that what it means for a racism to be structured not through what Etienne, you referred to as the color line, but through this problematic of laïcité, which is very different than what goes on in the US, right?
So many.
Okay, I know it's a lot of questions, but I just wanted to open discussion about racism, right, to both of you.
Who's speaking now? You, Mohamad, me, or your questions were addressed to me to a large extent, weren't they?
Well, it's a general conversation.
Both of us.
About,
okay. So can you
go first? Go first.
Give me 5 minutes. I think they are linked. You know, I mean, I'm one of the reasons, but not the only one, why I'm so fond of your book called Genealogical Science is not only its epistemological brilliance and political importance, but it's the fact that it adds to information and elements of reflection to something that has been, in a sense, my obsession for all the time. I mean, all those years, which was the idea that the invariant that remains there throughout the successive reformulations of what we might call theoretical racism, that is something that precedes 19th century evolutionism, social Darwinism, and pseudo-biological typologies of race. And that is there more than ever, or comes back to the fore after this ideology officially, at least, has been delegitimized, is precisely the genealogical scheme. That is the idea that race is something that is transmitted across generations, from fathers to sons and daughters, and so on, indefinitely. So two things to be said at this point. The color line doesn't fit very well in that pattern. So this seems to be, I don't renounce this idea. I don't renounce this idea, which I discussed with Derrida. You can find that online long time ago at Irvine. But I have to admit, and this is something I knew, but I learned in America from reading Du Bois, from listening to my colleagues, recent discussion with Nahum Chandler, talking to Fred Moten and many others, and everybody in this country, is that the color line is a racial scheme, of a division of humankind into two halves that is local and global, that divides humankind at the global scale, and locally has its strongest and most violent implementation, which is spatial and bodily, so to speak. And this is not exactly the same. It can be combined, of course, but this is not exactly the same as the genealogical scheme. Now, whether the racialization, I mean, the transformation of Islam into a racial denomination fits into one or the other one of these two, or forces us to add hopefully that won't make it impossible, unintelligible, but still another scheme. That's an open question, but I would be tempted to say, looking at France, I would be tempted to say that the religious stigma or name, the religious name, never really functions in isolation. I hope that Mohamad and you, Nadia, perhaps will agree with the idea that this whole thing takes place within the colonial and post-colonial framework. Therefore, the Muslims are not only Muslims, they are Arabs, they are Blacks, they are others from the South, from the former colonies. And there's a complex history of all that. So but then the question of migrants, because I'm too long one again. Of course, I was struck already a long time ago, as many sociologists and anthropologists and activists working on the neo-racism we had in France, and that became overwhelming with the in the 80s, I mean, with the new economic problems and so on and so on. The name migrant, in a sense, is a direct embodiment and translation of that genealogical scheme, because the migrant are the forefathers, the migrants are the forefathers, the migrants are the sons, the grandsons and granddaughters, etc., indefinitely. So this is a genealogical stigma typically, but the effect of that is of course to create something like, perhaps not a color line, but a line that allows it to isolate the foreign body. I return to the same idea, the alien, the enemy within, the one that is impossible to assimilate, and so on and so on, just like the Hispanic, or leave the United States aside. And of course, the more there are many, etc., there are millions. This becomes an absolutely insoluble problem. Now, still seen from France, Blackness, why not say white supremacy, why and how to articulate anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, anti-migrant discourses. In a country like France, all that merges in a sense, precisely because we are in the typical post-colonial situation. And therefore, the activists, the anti-racist movements who in France today, who have imposed progressively with huge resistances, of course, and fiercely attacked by the dominant elite, the notion that you must use the category race, which was anathema, officially banned from the French discourse, not because there are genetic biological races, but because there is a general process and phenomenon of racialization, which in France produces the word les racisés. Les racisés. They, of course, all massively, and there are few exceptions today, massively from the ex-colonial empire. So they are ex-colonized people. And from that point of view, of course, they all inherited the stigma and the despise and the hatred that the colonists had were imposing on their own colonial subjects. But this is not the universal situation. There is racism everywhere in the world. I mean, racism is not a private property or a privilege, if I may say so, of the North, the West, the ex-colonial countries, or the places where slavery used to be a dominant mode of production. It's overwhelming there, of course. And since these countries have had global influence, they're losing it now, but this created a kind of global pattern. But racism in India, by definition, of course, doesn't work like that. It's not a question of white supremacy. Racism in Northern Africa, which maybe has some in the Maghreb, which certainly owes something, of course, unfortunately, to the colonial legacy still there. also has other roots. Huh? And if you are black from Africa in Algeria or Morocco or Tunisia today, I'm not saying that everybody's a racist there, but there are racial problems, terrible racial problems. So the line is not drawn in the same manner. Therefore, white supremacy is an extremely important and even perhaps decisive globally. I can admit that point of fixation of racism. But if you want to reflect on the question of racism from a cosmopolitan point of view, and I know that Mohamad will not be happy with that term, or from the point of view of the politics of exclusions and violences in today's world, you cannot substitute, I would say. You ought not to ignore the decisive question of white supremacism, if only because it's expanding worldwide. I mean, the Great Replacement is a formula that was coined by a French racist writer, directly linked to the idea that the migrants are invading us, and it's now being invoked by a guy who murders Muslims in New Zealand or and other places. So white supremacism is an absolutely crucial reality, but I maintain it's not the only form.
Mohamad, do you want to step in?
I want to go back to the question you were asking, Nadia, about citizenship, right? I just have few comments about that, because I think that in the case, I mean, in the case of what is called in the French Empire, but is an institution that was partly created in Algeria, is of course this notion of the indigena, which I think to some extent you might say that it's an untranslatable concept, and it's, you know, even translating it into indigeneity or native, or even less so nativism, that all these concepts don't exactly translate what is at stake in indigena. Now, indigena, which means, you know, that actually Algerians were recognized as French nationals, but not French citizens. I mean, before 1870, as you know, I mean, I'm just saying obvious things that that most scholars, if not all scholars of the French Empire know. But the line of division was indistinctively or inseparably religion and race. Now, of course, as we know, before 1870, there were both Jews and Muslims who were considered as indigene and therefore not citizens. And this has changed after 1870, where, you know, when you can really say that actually being a Muslim means being a colonized subject, and there is an equation between both. Now, what is interesting, I think, from this point,
reversed during the fascist episode reversed very interestingly during the fascist episode in 40s, when in 1942, when the Jews were sent back to their condition of natives.
Yep. Yeah. And but the point I want to make is that interestingly, it shows that the secularity of citizenship is very important in the way in which the exclusion actually, both the exclusion and the condition of a possible inclusion actually functions, at least from an institutional point of view. And this is why I wouldn't say that the construction of religion, which in this case is actually inseparable from the codification and to some extent reformation of the Sharia by the French colonial state, that actually this the secularity of citizenship, and therefore the construction of this color line as religion, is important. It's important not to reduce it to what we already know of racism, because of course it is racism, but I think it has specific institutional effects and actually institutional forms of legitimacies that come from the fact that precisely we're talking religion, at least in the law, at least in the law, which of course doesn't mean that in other instances, this of course, this exclusion takes the form of blunt racism, of course. This probably would be a way of, and I was trying to suggest this during my introduction, would be also a way of making comparisons. And it's not to suggest that there is no anti-Blackness in France. That would be, of course, completely stupid. I would nevertheless say that two things at least, which are of course tentative and therefore can be discussed and so on. The first thing I would tend to say, which is more a question and a source of puzzlement, is that it's interestingly that for, and maybe it's linked, but it's interesting that for a country which claims to be so secular, if not the secular country in the world, which is France, that racism precisely takes I mean, speaks to some extent the theological language and speaks and constructs or reconstructs the color line via religion. The second thing I must say immediately, of course, when I say this, is that I would tend to say that Islamophobia, especially in France, but to what extent it could be applied elsewhere, I would tend to say that Islamophobia, because it's a kind of racism that is not explicitly, without any doubt, recognized as racism, because people would say, but no, it's not a race, it's a religion, so we have the right to criticize a religion, etc., and so forth. And all complications partly stem from this debate. Precisely because of this reason, and once again, because race is deployed as religion, precisely for this reason, I think it gives racism an institutional legitimacy that other forms of racism do not actually provide.
I agree with that.
So I think that we
because
should...
it is racism that doesn't speak race explicitly, so it can be.
Yeah,
it can deny its own very foundation.
Yes, exactly, and hence it gives a possibility, and it is actually an embodiment, a paradigm of the way in which racism functions through the denial of race, or we might say is the very denial of race. And I think that this point should be taken seriously. I wouldn't dare saying, it applies to the US because of 9/11, but I do think that there is a link there that should be taken seriously. In other words, that there is something about state racism or institutional racism that functions through Islamophobia, and that Islamophobia is particularly linked to the institutional dimension of it. This is what I would tend to say. Now, I think that in the case of Islamophobia, and Etienne, was pointing in the similar direction, but using other examples. And I would add to that I do think that white supremacy is, of course, a very, very central and important concept. I do think that it applies in France, despite what is sometimes said, oh no, there is no such thing as white supremacy and so on, which I don't think is true. But I was always dissatisfied, even amongst some anti-racist circles that I not only sympathize with, but I'm friends with and support in whatever way I can and so on. That whiteness in France is also linked to, for example, forms of secularism, not secularism per se. I mean, it's not what I want to argue, and it's not something I did argue in any case. But I do think that the specific effects, and they relate to what I was saying about Algeria, that if you reduce all this to a sort of a priori concept of white supremacy, or even institutional racism for that matter, then you won't be able to analyze, but also struggle against the specific forms of mechanisms that are at stakes. Now, because there are many, many, many questions in this, so I just want to add two or three things. I do think that...
Mohamad, can I say one thing before you do that? Because actually, I think what you're saying is incredibly important. And the point is, it is about structuring how one struggles against this precisely because of the possibility of it seeming more legitimate. And it really strikes me, it was this very powerful question about the Israeli state too, right?
About
versus
the Israeli state.
Israeli state, right? Whereas South Africa during apartheid spoke explicitly in the language of race. The Israeli state, from its very foundation, whether it was vis-a-vis Arab Jews or more fundamentally vis-a-vis Palestinians, is a state that is a racial state that does not speak in the name of race, and therefore has a kind of legitimacy. I mean, that's not the only reason, but I think it's an incredibly important reason that it can have a kind of legitimacy as a liberal state, because precisely it's a displacement of the explicit, which allows it to sort of exit that accusation of racism in a different way than what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But I think you're right that the problematics of a political struggle become really different when it doesn't actually speak race, right? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, I mean, just to be very brief, and thank you, Nadia, for this comment. I just want to respond and go in a similar direction than what has also been said by Etienne. I must admit maybe that part of our contention or whatever you want to call it about the one and the other and so on, which might seem very abstract to some people who are here, but actually includes the fact that I have some trouble. It's just, I must admit, that actually it's an interrogation for me, the way in which we tend to use concepts of otherness or of othering in order to describe functioning of racism. I think it's true of many forms of racism, but part of the questions, the provocative questions I was asking, is precisely to try and question the fact that we can always think of racism in that way, that is to say, as a form of othering. And I want to take seriously the fact that, you know, when we speak of these things, we use words that are concepts, and that in fact, otherness is a concept we use even in ordinary language, and there is no reason why we shouldn't, and I'm sure Etienne would agree with this, there's no reason why we shouldn't inquire into what seems to be very abstract problems, but in the end, structure also our political language. Now, what I want to say about that is that the impossibility to assimilate, and I do think that, you know, it's something we can say, it's about many forms of racism, which first of all was, you know, took the form of blood, as we know, and of course here, you know, I mean, many works can be mentioned, of course, Etienne's work, but also Gilani Jar or Anne Stoller's works have shown this. And I think that what it shows us is that what we call the impossibility to assimilate is inseparable from the impossibility to convert at some point, or what cannot be converted. And this is why I do think that in the case, for example, of Algeria, when one of the famous instances in which actually vindicate race or vindicated race was this expression Catholic Muslim. That is to say, race appears as what is being inconvertible, even if, you know, a colonized subject who's a Muslim becomes a Catholic, then race is what remains, even though the subject is being converted, which is just a remark I wanted to make. Now, the last question, because, you know, there are many points, is also, you know, let's say a heuristic question or whatever you want to call it, is
we're going to have to end very soon, so
okay, is that France is not a settler colonial state, but still that Algeria, and this is probably why we keep referring to this place, is precisely I could say this, the failed settler colonial attempt behind the French state, as it were. So this was the only remark I wanted to add.
Etienne, do you want to make so I know there are questions we haven't answered yet, but it's almost 4:10, so I think we're going to have to end, but I'm going to let Etienne say something quickly.
Yeah, there are myriads of questions. Everything that Mohamad says, almost everything that Mohamad says, which adds to the conviction that I completely share, that Islamophobia is a central, specific, and also increasingly expensive, so to speak, a form of racism today in some places, but many places in fact. And in the case of France, of course, immediately and directly rooted in the legacy of not only colonization in general, but that specific issue of the colonization of Algeria, because we should never forget that Algeria was supposed to be part of France itself. So I totally agree with that. Then to return for a minute to the question of yes, and as a consequence, there's also a question about that among the Q&R. Somebody who wants me to be more explicit on the question of laïcité and the reasons why laïcité, the specific French term for secularism, which has been co-opted or adopted very strikingly in some other countries in the world, you know, Turkey, Laiklik, and so on. So this is this the arch form of French racism? I would say that today it is, but that's my conviction, of course. It's the battleground. It's the battleground. Of course, and we do not agree on that, etc. I remain more than ever a critical secularist, and therefore I do not believe that the idea of secularism or laïcité in general can be identified with racism. But what I observe, and this also has deep roots in the colonial past, for the reasons that you indicate, is the fact that laïcité, which is a constitutional principle, and therefore very easily transformed into a statist and nationalist motto in France, has progressively become either the axis or perhaps the smoke screen behind which Islamophobia is constructed in France. And that, of course, is a life and death issue for, I'd say, democratic principles in a country like France. And I still believe that anti-racist struggle needs to make use of democratic principles and such as equal rights and others, and equal dignity, and etc. And which leads me to the last point, and I know perhaps I'm giving what we call in French des verges pour me faire battre, a stick or a weapon for you to beat me, but I think it's interesting, it's instructive, you know. Some time ago, when the anti racist movement from the banlieue, the suburbs, where precisely blacks and browns and Muslims are, with some difficulties, but nevertheless joining in a common denunciation of state and institutional racism, started to set up the pandemic cut it, but demonstrations. I wrote a paper in which I completely endorsed the movement, but I said I have the reservations about the use, and lots of comrades and friends told me, "Oh, you're on the wrong side." I said I have reservations about the use in the French context of the category the white privilege, which is not very far from the white supremacy. And the reason I gave, and I put that on the table for discussion, but I'm not sure I'm right, was the fact I said, you're directly playing into the hands of those neo-fascist movements in France, for which the idea of the great replacement, in Europe, the great replacement and other similar ideologies are progressively becoming the mantra, whose essential target now, of course, is to divide the people in the suburbs, the poor workers or jobless, etc., people of many different origins, in order to even more transform the the whites, let's call it like them, into sections and active groups supporting murderous racism, which is the case in many places in the US today, but is not yet the case in Europe in the same form. And we ought to resist that by all means.
Thank you. You know, it is 4:15, so I actually think I'm going to need to end this. So
I just have a very
short, okay,
small and short comment to make. I certainly never and wouldn't say, never said and wouldn't say that secularism is the matrix of racism, or is even less so that it's the same thing, or not at all. I think the only thing, and we discussed this in many other ways, but I do think that what is happening now in France, we should talk about that more, but is the end. So is that sometimes we tend to reduce French laïcité and think of its irreducibility or untranslatability as being linked to the fact that it's a privatization, so-called radical privatization of religion. And I don't think it's the case, and I don't think it has ever been the case, because there is what is called, even in the Loi 1905, which is the law of separation, what is called the police des cultes. Now, I don't say that laïcité is reducible to a police des cultes. That is to say, the right that the state has to actually surveil communities, religious communities, and so on. It's not only this, but partly or at least predominantly. And that I do think that it's possible to diagnose that in the case of Islam, and the fact that Islamophobia is sort of becoming more and more central in the very definition of what laïcité is becoming, then it seems that French secularism is increasingly becoming a police des cultes, which doesn't mean it's reducible to a police des cultes, but that there is this process, that
official secularism.
Yeah, official secularism. Okay. I'm talking about yeah. This is what I was talking about.
I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to end this. We are losing participants anyway, although we still have a good 30 people on the call. I want to thank you both for an incredibly rich discussion. And for the audience for sticking in with this very odd format that we're all stuck in.
The invisible auditors. Thanks.
And we're sorry we did not get to all of the questions, but this has been great. And if it's a continuing conversation, it may get staged again, since it is a continuing conversation. So thank you both very much. And thank you to the audience. And I guess we are out. Thank you.
We are out.
Thank you.
Bye.